Various levels. Some are a little bit easier for the simpler things. Some are much, much harder for much more complicated things. And all of them take a certain amount of effort to get the change to happen. The other way of thinking about it is, all right, we don't want to change anything. We just want to be able to build what we can. You'll often hear people talk about that they can build by right. And so what that's saying is, all right, we've read the zoning code, and in the code it says for this district, we're allowed to build a single family house. And so we're going to build that on that site, and nobody can challenge us, at least not on from a zoning standpoint, because we have by right the ability to build there. We wouldn't necessarily in that residential district have by right the ability to build a toxic waste dump or something like that. So the concept here is you have a series of things that you can do by right. If you need to make a change, then you ask for an administrative adjustment. If you need to make a bigger change, then you apply for a variance. If you need to make a bigger change, then you're trying to get an amendment. And obviously, at any of those three, the administrative adjustment, variance, and the amendment, you might win, you might lose, right? It could go either way. PUD is another really important concept that you should know, and that's a planned unit development. Some places it's called a PD, a planned development. I think there's a couple of other terms, but for the most part, most of the country uses PUD, and I believe the exam uses PUD. And the PUD is this concept that, all right, you're putting forth something into, you're trying to get a project done. A sort of classic example of a PUD would be for, say, multiple houses. You're going to do a series of, say, townhouses in some city. And the way that the zoning is set up, typical sort of zoning rules are in site plan. I've got a set of property lines, and the expectation is that I'm going to have a single major primary building, and that I might have an accessory building of some sort, that maybe it's a garage or something, some sort of thing, but it's clearly an accessory building to the major primary use. So the major primary use might be, say, a multifamily building, and then it has a small garage building, something like that. That's sort of a typical, what most zoning is set up for. But if we're in a situation where, well, that's not what we're going to do here, what we really want to be able to do on this site is, instead of having that one primary building and then this accessory building, we're going to do something where you can drive into the middle, and we're going to do a series of these townhouses, and they're going to face into that middle space. And we now have, in this particular little example, not only two separate buildings, but both of them are primary use buildings. They're both the primary use, which is housing. And then they all have garages in their own or something, right? So this is a situation where it seems reasonable, right? It seems fairly urban, and it seems like it's probably in line with the spirit of what the city officials would like, but it doesn't meet this sort of original idea of what that particular zoning district would allow. So what do? Well, what you do is a PUD, or it's a planned unit development. And what you're doing here is you're saying, all right, we clearly don't meet, in our proposal clearly doesn't meet the zoning. And it's not like we could get an amendment to say it would meet the zoning. Like, it's not like there's we can't change from R3 to an R4. Like, it still isn't going to meet the zoning. So it's not like it's a simple process that we can go through, and it's certainly not an administrative adjustment level of change, because that's a pretty major change. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to write our own zoning code. So we're going to write our whole thing about all the issues we've talked about. So setbacks, we're going to talk about the FAR, we're going to talk about how we're going to do the massing on it, we're going to talk about how the parking is going to work, we're going to talk about what the frontage is going to look like and what the rules are for that. We're going to talk about how street lighting would work and compare that to the existing zoning code. So it's just going to go, we're literally going to write a little mini zoning code for this one site. And then we're going to take that mini zoning code and we're going to present it to the zoning department. So we're going to take our little new zoning code that we've written and documented, and it's going to be partly done by the architect and partly done by zoning lawyers because there's going to be different expertise moments for both. We're going to present that to the zoning department, and then typically what's going to happen from there is that the zoning department will review it, decide whether they think it's plausible or not. They'll add their 2 cents in. They'll ask for certain kinds of changes. So they'll send it back with things to review and things to change. And then we make those changes or argue against them, whatever. And then we send it back to the zoning department. If the zoning department feels that it's sort of reasonable enough and a reasonably good idea for the city, the zoning department will then send it on to the city council or whatever form that municipality has for its self-governance, and the city council will then vote on it because it's just like an amendment. It's just like the zoning code itself. It's a code, which is like a law. There's a subtle difference legally between codes and laws, but for our purposes, it's essentially a law. And so it has to be adopted like any other law. It gets voted in by the city legislature, the city council of some sort. And so they say, yes, we think this is a reasonable zoning change, or not. It's not a reasonable zoning change. If they say, yes, it is, it gets given a number, and it literally changes the map. Next time you open up the zoning code, you'll see, let's say it was PUD number 14, right? It'll actually say on the map, PUD 14, and then you can go to the city hall or village hall or whatever and find the write-up for what PUD 14 is, and it'll tell you what all the setbacks need to be, what the FAR is, and all of that. And that is now the zoning code for that particular site. And so the thought here is, you write a zoning code in order to sort of help generate development and control it in ways that make it sort of best for everybody. It's really hard to know what's best for everybody, especially over a span of time. Over 15, 20, 30, 50 years, things change. The economics of things change. The economics of retail has changed recently. People wanting to live in the suburbs versus wanting to live in the downtowns, that's sort of in flux a bit. So, these kinds of things start to change, and the zoning code needs to be relatively nimble. Well, you can't just change the zoning code all the time, because if you did that, it would be just confusing and complicated and be hard for developments that sometimes take 5-10 years to develop. You can't just keep changing the zoning code on them. But you can allow a certain amount of nimbleness by having something like a PUD that allows for sort of innovative ideas to sort of bubble up through from developers, bubble up through that as a system, goes into the zoning department. They have the opportunity to sort of vet it and to make sure that it makes sense in the sort of current thinking about what the city wants to be able to do. They vet it, and then it goes into the political system, and then they can either adopt or not adopt. And this allows for a lot of potential just sort of changes without having to sort of wholly rewrite a zoning code, which can take a long time. Plus, you wouldn't necessarily want to wholly rewrite a zoning code to make it so that all of these districts now are for townhouses, because maybe it's a passing fad. Maybe it's something that happens for a couple of years, and then there's enough townhouses, and now, okay, we're done with that. Now we're moving on to mid-rises or something. So if you're a zoning official, you want to provide this kind of nimbleness, but not necessarily just sort of follow every trend and rewrite the zoning code every time. So PUD, planned unit development, it's a very important sort of concept for how things change kind of on the fly. It's a lot of work. You have to write this whole zoning code, and there's a lot of lawyers involved and all that. It can cost a lot of money, but it also means that a lot of the times it's the only way that you can actually do that kind of project. So it's a very useful thing, and it seems just likely that's the kind of thing that would show up on the exam. So administrative adjustments, simple ones, variances and amendments getting a little bit harder, more people involved, more political, and then a much harder one, which is the PUD, which is really changing the code altogether for that site.